As we've mentioned earlier in the program, ethics. Ethics came up very, very quickly in this new Congress, and ethics is going to be an issue lingering in front of us, if only by negative example, in the years to come in Washington, D.C. So here to talk to us about the ethics issue, returning to the show once again, is Liz Kennedy. Liz is the Director of Democracy and Government Reform at the Center for American Progress. And she's been looking at this issue quite closely. They have a new report. So first of all, Liz, thanks for joining us once again.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the fascinating drama that played out in the first 24 hours or so of the new Republican Congress over the House Ethics Committee, the Office of Congressional Ethics. That's an independent bipartisan group. We heard a lot of confusing stories about what the Republicans tried to do and then why it didn't happen. So just give us your overview on that, if you would.
Sure. It was quite the way to start the year and to start a unified Republican government where folks had run on the promise of draining the swamp. Instead, what we saw was in a secret vote in a closed party meeting, the Republican majority voted to change the proposed rules, which is how Congress kind of sets the rules for itself in every congressional two-year session. And the night before the rules were going to be adopted, they had, of course, been put out in December. One of the changes that was offered was to really do away with, to totally gut Congress's one independent ethics watchdog, the Office of Congressional Ethics. So whereas in the December draft of the rules, OCE, as it's called, was set to be reauthorized, much to everyone's relief on the left and the right. So this is an office that was set up about 8 years ago after the last huge rounds of congressional scandals after the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandals and what have you. A bipartisan group got together, figured out how are we really going to be better at policing ourselves. The House Ethics Committee had not really been doing much of a job whatsoever, so they decided to set up this independent panel that with investigatory powers. So this is what the Republicans in the dead of night then tried to, do away with, essentially. However, the media caught wind of this, reported it accurately, and citizen phone calls just flooded in. Americans were not having it. So a few short hours later, really before noon on the next day, the majority dropped its attack on the OCE, though unfortunately we believe that there may continue to be efforts to defang it going forward.
Yeah, and I think something you said is really important, Liz Kennedy, which is you said the people were not having it, because a lot of the reporting I saw, I do agree that the media reported on this attempted move accurately. I think there was some misreporting afterwards, which suggested, not all of the reporting was bad, but some of the reporting suggested that it was Donald Trump who stopped it, because Donald Trump tweeted about it. But I want to run my impression of what happened by you and see if you agree. One, if you look at Donald Trump's tweet on the subject, it didn't say it was a bad idea, which I think it clearly is. It said, well, don't do it as the first thing. Maybe the order of priorities is wrong. Donald Trump never said you shouldn't get rid of this bipartisan independent Office of Congressional Ethics. He just said, I don't know about doing it first thing. So I'm not going to give Donald Trump any points for courage here, number one. And number two, knowing the way things operate on Capitol Hill, I suspect that Republicans were far more likely, as any legislator would be, to respond to a flood of constituent calls, which we know did happen, than they are to respond to a single tweet. But hey, I could be wrong. What's your thought on it?
No, that's absolutely right, RJ. I mean, looking at the tweet, he says and it's a little silly to be defining public policy by tweets, but that's where we are. So he says, he says the office is unfair, and then he just says that the problem is, why should this be their number one act and priority? His, one of his spokespeople then explaining those statements said, it's not a question of strengthening or weakening, it's a question of priorities. That's a quote from Sean Spicer. So it's absolutely something where, Trump was just saying, don't do this as the number one act, which it really is. For a group of politicians not to see this as just politically a horrible idea, to step out and have the first thing you do to get rid of your ethics watchdog. I mean, the thing is that it was clear to the American people what they were trying to do, and Americans took action, fought back, and saved the office for now. Now, we just all need to have the number of our representatives on speed dial at this point. And if anything, hopefully we can use this, really take this as kind of marching orders going forward. We do know that citizen action works. We have always known that the person who gets the most votes wins at the ballot box, and citizen action continues in terms of having your voices heard once folks are in office. We need the people in office to be representing all of us and fairly representing all of us. So
let me just jump in for a second, Liz. First of all, on that thing about the person getting the most votes winning, I'll get back to you on that. But
perhaps, sadly, not with our electoral college.
Not
Good point.
Always. And if you read some of the studies on Congress, there's some. Well, I guess the person with the most votes wins, but there's a lot of gerrymandering. That said, I just want to give a big amen to what you were saying about the power of citizen action. I think that is so critical, and I think that's the lesson here. And let me tell you one dimension of this I worry about, and then I want to get to some of your recommendations for really deepening and expanding reform. One of my concerns is Congress as a whole is so disrespected by voters. 18%, I believe, is the last figure I saw, approval rating. I would like to see Democrats, and there's a little bit of partisan talk and a policy discussion, but it's just my thought that I would like to see Democrats, or for that matter, any members of Congress of any party, really becoming the voices for ethics, for defending the OCE, for expanding ethics reform. I want voters to have a clear choice between what we've now seen from the Republican Party, which I interpret as the party of lax ethics, or loose ethics, loose morals, as they used to say, and someone who represents an alternative, which is an agenda of strong ethical reform. Does that make sense to you?
We absolutely need people to be standing up and providing clear solutions on that will actually work on how to stop wealthy special interests from having an improper and anti-democratic, frankly, amount of influence on the levers of government. So, some of that is in the ethics things that you noted with the Office of Congressional Ethics. The Office of Government Ethics, of course, has been doing a wonderful job standing up and saying, we police the ethics compliance in the executive branch, and Donald Trump's conflicts of interest violate all of the ethical prohibitions, in the executive branch. We know that they have come out and said that even though the criminal conflicts of interest statute doesn't technically apply to the president and vice president, they made that choice. Congress made that choice when they passed it in order to give the president leeway in acting, not at all thinking that there would ever be someone holding the highest office in our land who wouldn't voluntarily divest themselves and resolve any financial conflicts of interest. But even then, the Office of Government Ethics has concluded that the president and vice president should conduct themselves as if they were so bound by that law. And I do think that you're right, that, we see polling results that absolutely tell us that 75% of Americans believe that corruption in government is widespread. But we also see results that say that nearly 3/4 of Americans believe that with the right kind of leadership, the federal government can be a force for good. The important thing to remember is that, 20 million people have health care because Congress passed a healthcare modernization act, the Obamacare Affordable Care Act. So we need government to be a force for good. Government does such important work throughout the country and in really so many, really all of our lives in one way or another.
So Social Security and Medicare. Yeah, Social Security and Medicare, the two most
clean
popular
air
programs.
and clean water.
Clean air, clean water.
Our public lands.
Yeah, and not the crime fighting. We could go on and on. So
exactly.
So I'm absolutely with you on that too. And my big fear, and we're talking with Liz Kennedy of the Center for American Progress. My big fear, Liz, is that look, Trump is going to be so corrupt, and people talk about the emoluments clause and so on. We're talking about loot. Emoluments means loot, essentially. That this presidency is going to be so corrupt that I want to fight disillusionment and keep exactly the sense of idealism that you're talking about right now. So when we talk about fighting corruption, and corruption is not always illegal, let's remember that too, right?
That's exactly right.
When we're talking about a more ethical government, a truly ethical government, you guys have just done a report talking about how to make our government more ethical. Tell me, what are you recommending in that report?
Sure. We know that the American people care deeply about these issues of political corruption, and we know that there are solutions that can really work, strong, clear proposals on lobbying, on the kind of foxes guarding the henhouse that happens with revolving door that keeps, when business interests come in and out of government, it can too often mean that the interests of business are prioritized instead of the interests of all of us, on public corruption laws, and on government and contractor oversight, as well as these direct conflicts of interest that clearly exist with Trump in a way that is utterly unconstitutional, but also infect so many of his nominees. There's a whole report with important data and policy solutions. Some of the highlights, obviously requiring the president, vice president, and families to divest their financial conflicts. Right now, that is proving just a real threat to our national security, the integrity of the presidency. We would also require members of Congress to disclose the time they spend fundraising, for example, and attending fundraising events, because they're not really working for our interests when they're working to raise money for their own reelection. So at the very least, we should be able to get a more full sense of that. We would ban members of Congress from becoming paid special interest lobbyists for life, and require offices, congressional offices, and the executive branch to publish their lobbying contacts, again, so that we know more and can do more to fight the improper influence of wealthy special interests over our government representatives, and move away from a system of conflicts of interest and move towards a system of fair representation. So one last thing I'll just note, we also propose banning special interest lobbyists from fundraising or bundling money in politics to the members of Congress that they are then, lobbying. It's a horrible system, because right now our representatives are dependent on and thus responsive to too many wealthy special interests to then listen to so many folks. I do want to note all of these things are just a step forward, because what we really need is a holistic framework that also empowers people through citizen-owned elections and voting rights and voter access, redistricting, as we've mentioned. But these public corruption laws and lobbying ethics, revolving door, et cetera, are an important first step, certainly what the American people, are expecting and demanding. So we're really thrilled to offer these solutions.
Yeah, and I love your use of the word holistic, because I do think we need a holistic solution in the long term. But, they say sunlight is the best disinfectant. If people really understood how much time their members of Congress spend raising money, if they really understood the influence lobbyists have as bundlers, as fundraisers, as givers of cash, and so on, they'd be shocked, and that would create the movement toward the kind of holistic reform you're talking about. So I think it's great that you're on this case. I'm delighted to hear it. I look forward to seeing more people read your report in depth. Where can they find that?
It's at the AmericanProgress.org, the website, and the report is called Drain the Swamp at AmericanProgress.org. And I'll just say last, RJ, I think right now Americans do know and certainly believe, as we've said, how much influence wealthy special interests have over our government. The problem is not to succumb to cynicism. But when we talk about, you described something I was saying as idealistic or having idealism. I think this is just a realistic assessment of what we need to do to really secure representative self-government for ourselves and our progeny, essentially. So this is just a realistic, clear view of how to revitalize democracy. Cynicism be damned, but we don't need idealistic, proposals either. We need some real clear proposals and then to call into Congress to demand that they happen.
Great, well said, and I'll just close by that's just a semantic difference because I think idealism is realistic. But Liz Kennedy, Director of Democracy and Government Reform at the Center for American Progress, thanks for writing this report, or preparing this report with your team, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, RJ. Have a great day.
You too.